The curious nature of fear. Man has never been one for humility, even when it suits his interests. Even if a well-disguised truth is hidden in the murkiest veil of darkness, it is man's tendency to continue an existence of denial, even though confession would mean his most glorious liberation from that which terrifies him. Of the countless examples I could cite, there are many common occurrences in the daily life of everyday individuals that give one pause for both creative reflection and existential dread. And yet, in spite of these common occurrences, indeed these relatively ordinary occurrences, we are all hesitant to acknowledge them, for to do so would give them a reality that we are not inclined to grant. When man seeks the warmth and comforting refuge of reason, he often finds himself doing so in vain when confronted with these trifles of terror, these enigmas of infamy. For man is not strictly a creature of reason, but of instinct. That is to say, that which is often unreasonable can still nonetheless be a reality, if not here and not now, then perhaps there and later. And despite one of these certain nearly unspeakable things not happening here or now, the mere idea conjured in the mind of he who thinks these things is enough for him to consider them of happening at an altogether different time and place. The apprehension builds in his mind, from apprehension to dread, from dread to terror. He recalls with horror one of those unspeakable occasions that all of man has experienced at one time or another. Such as the moment we climb into bed, seeking the sweet refuge of sleep, and find, for seemingly no reason whatsoever, of the distinct impression of being watched. Yes, that haunting, foreign, yet unmistakable notion that many have felt but few acknowledge. I am not speaking of those things which occasion childhood. Oh no, indeed not. For the fact of things is that maturation does not guarantee the departure of these nefarious experiences, despite our best efforts to convince ourselves. We wrestle with this trifle that is indeed not a trifle at all, but an epoch that still occasionally defies even the most skeptical and pious minds. For what person has not heard an account of someone who denies and defies the existence of all things shadowy and mysterious, and yet, when given the opportunity to indulge said shadowy and mysterious things, does he which blusters bravery not shrink back? For what person, even pondering the possibility of speaking to a dearly departed loved one, would refuse such an opportunity, even if such occasion required participation in those arcane practices which have laid in the shadows of human existence from the dawn of time? For if such a skeptical person remains unsure of such proposition, then what has he to lose by at least attempting to do so, even if the chance of success is remote? Regardless, such persons hesitate, because there is a lurking fear which they, for whatever reason or reasons, does not acknowledge. Indeed, not even the most withering accusations of cowardice against such an individual will compel them forward into the shadowy embrace of the unknown. For the temporary embarrassment brought about in a brief moment pales in comparison the unknown horrors that could await him in merely a moment. For we humans are not merely creatures of occasional reason and instinct, but of careful calculation, analysis, and measure. But with what measure do we seek to analyze and calculate these elusive things, these things which defy logic, reason, understanding? Or What other occasions may we consider? Perhaps those occasions which, when we are quiet and alone in the safety and comfort of our homes, engaging in a quiet activity, such as sitting in a minimally illuminated room, suddenly, with complete and unreserved lack of expectation, we are prepared to swear by all that is holy, beloved, sacred, and just, that we have plainly and clearly observed movement nearby, though we be completely alone. Or worse still, we consider for a fleeting yet harrowing moment that we have heard a trifle, the nature of which hardly matters, whether we have considered to have heard a whisper, our name being called from afar, a footstep either in the dark interior of our abode or in the shadows outside. Now that I have set the stage, it is appropriate that I call attention to the ultimate purpose of my ponderings just previously illustrated. You see, it is I who happen to be one of the very spectres I have described, and it is now my duty to inform you of how I have arrived at this state. You see, dear reader, I was not unlike you are now, possessing a mortal shroud which covered my ethereal existence, like those people which travel the vast deserts of Arabia, who seek refuge in tents from the intense energy of sunlight. Like the Arabian abodes, my body shielded me, that which is truly me, from the immense, boundless realities of that which lies beyond, and that which I am now a part of, that thing which marvels and compels man to wonderment and fear. The path I travelled to arrive in this state occurred in an instance of one of those common tales I have previously described. It was a dark and stormy night, as many frightful tales begin, and I was at home. I was about to commence my daily evening ritual of preparing for slumber, when a series of rightfully hair-raising, ominous, and other worldly events would visit me. It all began with the seemingly innocuous observation that the door was ajar, for I perceived that the sound of water and rain suddenly became quite vivid from the other end of the house. I inspected the door and saw no sign of violent entry. Such entry would indeed had to have been violent, as I was always cautious of locking my doors and windows. I secured the door and proceeded to bed, with curious, bewildered, and haunting thoughts polluting my mind. The arrival in bed brought little comfort. The storm, which had escalated since I departed to my chambers, seemed adamant to prevent my escape into the nightly void of peace and silence. Alternatively, the storm's ferociousness may indeed have been an attempt at warning me of what was to come. Around midnight, I awoke with a rather dramatic explosion of violent screaming into my pitch-black bedroom. At first, I sat up momentarily bewildered, not knowing whether or not the scream was in fact my own, as the penetrating sound echoed throughout the house, creating the perception of uncertain origin. Out of frustration, fear, and resolve, and against my better judgment, I lay hold of the small but potent bottle containing tincture of opium at my bedside, and consumed the entire vessel in a single brisk motion. Collapsing back into the embrace of my bed, the sheets and blankets warmed my body, I resolved to not let the uncertain and ominous shadows of the night to prevent my descent into slumber no longer, for now the cloud of opium descended on me. But fate had no such refuge intended for me, for my head had barely sank into my pillow before all the tortured throes of a nightmarish sleep befell me. In the midst of this dance with the shadows of sleep, I perceived what I thought was someone shouting for me to awake. Despite the seemingly real and pervasiveness of this phantom voice, I desperately struggled against the shackles of consciousness that I sought to liberate myself from, if even a bit longer, before daybreak. Alas, dear reader, my senses were wrenched from the amnesty of tortured sleep and into the still pitch darkness of my bedroom, with no more thundering outside crashing down from the skies, but another kind of violence altogether. With my mind muddled from exhaustion, restlessness, and clouded from opium, my immediate fear of the sound of heavy knocks at the door, along with muffled voices, excited me to uncontrollable anger, which promptly drowned any fear I felt. With rage bursting from my chest, I thrust my hand into my bedside table, grabbed my pistol, and headed for the door. The knocks and shouts grew increasingly louder, my steps becoming heavier, harder and faster as I approached the damned commotion. With a hearty heft, I wrenched open the door and immediately saw the bright glow of a lantern and the vague features of faces, followed by a sudden brightness, headache, and swoon, and found myself back in my bed. My sudden relief at the experience of what I had now realized was a dream, was immense and complete. Nevertheless, I felt inclined to arise and check the house. My heart leapt in my chest when I heard the same voices from before, this time inside, not outside. Rushing back into my chambers to grab my pistol, I jumped back in horror. I had no hand to grab the gun. I had no arm, no chest, no body at all. I had become completely ethereal. As my immense shock set in, I turned back to the voices. 3 police officers were gathered in the foyer, lanterns raised, looking down at the floor, at my body, now bloodied and pale, with a single gunshot wound directly in the middle of my forehead. Before I could ponder what I was experiencing, I felt someone tap me on my now invisible shoulder. Leaping with fright, I spun around and saw, to my astonishment and horror, Death himself, with all the terror of his reputation before him. With my new and untested existence, I bolted through the bodies of the 3 police officers before me and into the forest beyond, but not before I heard one of them exclaim he felt a sudden chill rush through him. Into the shadows of the forest I zoomed, refusing to be arrested by the dark spectre.